She was 21 years old and homeless. No family, no savings. Just $10 in a backpack she had been living out of for 3 months. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned ranger station deep in the mountains of Idaho, in a wilderness so remote that the nearest paved road was 14 miles away. The Forest Service said it was unsafe. The county said it had been condemned for decades, but what nobody knew was that locked inside that old ranger cabin in a sealed metal cabinet that had not been touched in over 50 years was something that would change her life forever. This is the story of Wren Calloway, and it begins not in the mountains of Idaho, but on a kitchen floor in Spokane, Washington, 13 years before she ever set foot in that cabin. Wren was 8 years old the first time her mother found her sitting cross-legged on the linoleum. The family road atlas spread open across her lap. The atlas was old. Its spine cracked, its pages soft from years of handling. It had belonged to Wren's grandfather, a man she had never met, and it smelled like dust and gasoline and something faintly sweet that she could never quite identify. Her mother, Marlene, stood in the doorway of the kitchen with a coffee cup in her hand, watching her daughter trace the green spaces on the map with one small finger. National forests, wilderness areas, state parks, the places that did not belong to anybody. Marlene asked what she was doing. Wren did not look up. She said, "Looking at where I'm gonna live someday." Marlene smiled and shook her head and went back to whatever she was doing. She worked as a bookkeeper at a feed store outside of town. She was practical and careful, and she believed in things she could count and verify. She thought her daughter's fascination with empty places on maps was a phase, something she would grow out of. It was not a phase. Wren's father had left when she was 4 years old. She did not remember him. She did not remember his face or his voice or the way he smelled. She did not remember whether he had held her or read to her or sung to her before bed. All she knew about him was that he had been there, and then he was not. And Marlene never spoke about him except to say that some people were not built for staying. Wren understood this even as a child. Some people were not built for staying. She wondered sometimes if she was one of them. Marlene raised her alone in a small ranch house on a quiet street in a suburb where nothing ever happened. The lawns were always mowed. The cars were always washed. The neighbors waved but never visited. It was the kind of place Marlene preferred because it was safe and predictable and nothing in it would ever surprise her. It was the kind of place Wren could not wait to leave. She was good in school but bored. She finished her homework in 15 minutes and then sat at her desk staring out the window at the line of identical houses across the street, wondering what was beyond them, wondering what was beyond the edge of town, beyond the edge of the state, beyond the farthest road on any map she had ever seen. She started reading books about expeditions and survival, and people who built cabins in the woods and lived there alone miles from anyone. She read about trappers and explorers and naturalists who walked into the wilderness and did not come back for years. She read every Jack London story she could find by the time she was 12. She carried a copy of Walden in her backpack all through high school, though she never actually finished it. She found Thoreau a little too pleased with himself, but she understood what he was trying to say. She understood the longing for a place that was your own, a place that no one else wanted, a place where you could hear yourself think, Wren started camping alone when she was 14. She would take the bus to the trailhead with her gear packed into a borrowed backpack and walk into the mountains for 3 days at a time. She learned how to read a topographic map. She learned how to filter water from streams. She learned how to identify edible plants and which berries would make you sick and which mushrooms would kill you. She learned how to start a fire in the rain, how to hang her food from a tree so the bears would not get it, how to navigate by the stars when the trail disappeared. Marlene did not approve, but Marlene also did not know how to stop her. Wren was the kind of kid who decided things and then did them. Arguing with her was like arguing with weather. You could complain about it all you wanted, but it was gonna do what it was gonna do. And the only thing you could control was whether you had an umbrella. By the time Wren was 17, she had hiked over 800 miles of trail in Washington and Idaho, mostly alone, mostly off trail. She knew the mountains the way some people knew the streets of their hometown. She knew which passes were safe in early spring and which ones held snow until July. She knew where the best campsites were, where the water ran cleanest, where you could stand on a ridge and see 50 miles in every direction without seeing another human being. The mountains were the only place she felt like herself, the only place she felt like she belonged. And then her mother got sick. It was March of the year Wren turned 19. Marlene had been complaining about stomach pain for weeks. She thought it was an ulcer. She thought it was stress. She thought it was the cheap coffee at the feed store, which had always tasted like it had been brewed in a tin can. The doctor told her it was pancreatic cancer, stage 4. 6 weeks later, Marlene was dead. Wren was with her at the end. She sat beside the hospital bed and held her mother's hand and watched her breathe each breath a little shallower than the one before. Each exhale a little longer until finally there was an exhale that did not have an inhale after it. And the room went quiet and Wren was alone. Completely alone. Marlene had been her only family, and Wren had been Marlene's only family. There were no siblings, no aunts or uncles, no cousins who sent Christmas cards. There was just the two of them, mother and daughter, in that quiet house, on that quiet street in that suburb where nothing ever happened. And now there was just Wren. After the funeral, she went back to the house to pack. But there was nothing to pack. The house was rented. The car had been repossessed during Marlene's medical leave. The savings, what little there had been, was gone, eaten by hospital bills and hospice care, and all the small expenses that accumulate when someone is dying and no one is working. Wren stood in the empty living room and looked around at the walls that had contained her childhood, the carpet where she had spread out the road atlas, the window where she had sat and stared at the houses across the street, the kitchen where her mother had found her tracing green spaces with her finger and had smiled and shaken her head and thought it was a phase. She had $400 to her name. She did not know what she was gonna do, but she knew it would involve mountains. It always did. For 2 years, Wren lived like a ghost. She picked apples in Wenatchee in the fall, sleeping in a tent at the edge of the orchard with the other seasonal workers, most of them older than her, most of them with stories they did not want to tell. She washed dishes at a backpacker hostel in Seattle, trading labor for a bunk bed in a room with 7 strangers who came and went like weather. She did trail maintenance for the Forest Service for one summer in the North Cascades, and that was the closest thing to heaven she had ever experienced. Long days in the mountains with a Pulaski axe in her hands, building water bars on muddy trails clearing deadfall, sleeping in a tent at a base camp, 3 miles from the nearest road. The pay was $11 an hour. She would have done it for free, but the seasonal work ended when the seasons changed. The apple harvest finished. The hostel cut staff for the winter. The trail crew disbanded in September and would not reform until May. And Wren was left to drift again from couch to bus station, to hostel bed, always moving, never staying, carrying everything she owned on her back. By the time she was 21, she had been in transit for almost 2 years. And she was tired. Not tired of the mountains, never tired of the mountains, but tired of being between them. Tired of bus stations and library computers and the smell of other people's laundry. Tired of waking up in a different place every week and never knowing where she would sleep the week after. She wanted somewhere to put her bag down, not somewhere to live in the way most people meant the word. Not an apartment with a lease and a rental application and a credit check. Not a room in someone else's house where she had to ask permission to use the kitchen. She wanted somewhere remote, somewhere difficult, somewhere hers. Somewhere that nobody else wanted because the things nobody else wanted were the only things she could afford. She found the listing in February, scrolling through Forest Service surplus property pages on a library computer in Coeur d'Alene. The Forest Service occasionally sold off old administrative buildings that they no longer needed. Fire lookouts, ranger stations, work camps. Most of them had been auctioned off years ago to people who wanted weekend cabins or hunting lodges or a story to tell at dinner parties. But some sat in legal limbo, the parcels too small or too remote or too encumbered with restrictions to attract bidders. The listing Wren found was for an old district ranger station in the Salmon Chalice National Forest in central Idaho. It sat on a parcel of inholding land that had been deeded to a private holder back in the 1920s and had reverted to the county after the original family died out without heirs. The building had been used as a ranger outpost from 1927 to 1971, when the Forest Service consolidated its operations and closed the station. It had been sitting empty ever since. 53 years of emptiness. 53 years of dust and silence and snow piling up on the roof every winter and melting every spring and no one there to see it. The county had been trying to sell it at tax auction with no success since 2008. The current asking price was $10. Wren stared at the screen. $10. She read the listing again, looking for the catch. There was always a catch. Nothing cost $10 unless something was very wrong with it. The catch was the access. The ranger station was 14 miles from the nearest paved road. 8 of those miles were on a Forest Service road that was closed to vehicles from October to June due to snow. The remaining 6 miles were on a foot trail that climbed over a 7,200-foot pass. There was no electricity, no running water, no septic system, no phone service, no internet. No way to get there in winter except on foot or on skis. The nearest town was Stanley, Idaho. Population 116. An hour from the trailhead. Wren looked at the listing for a long time. Then she opened another tab and found a topographic map of the area. She found the parcel on the map, a small blue square in the middle of a sea of green forest and brown contour lines. She traced the trails that led to it. She measured the distances. She calculated the elevation gain. She looked at where the creeks ran and where the ridges formed natural windbreaks and where the south-facing slopes would catch the most sun. She looked at the empty space around the cabin. Miles of empty space. Miles of wilderness in every direction. No roads, no houses, no power lines, no cell towers. Just mountains. Wren opened a third tab and looked up bus schedules from Coeur d'Alene to Stanley. 2 weeks later, she was standing at the trailhead. The bus had dropped her in Stanley just after noon. Stanley was barely a town at all. Just a main street with a general store and a gas station and a diner and a few dozen houses scattered along the road. The Sawtooth Mountains rose up behind it like a wall of stone, their peaks still heavy with late-season snow. Wren had eaten lunch at the diner. A cheeseburger and fries and a chocolate milkshake because she did not know when she would eat hot food again. The woman behind the counter was named Opal Brennan, and she ran the place by herself. She was somewhere in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a braid and hands that looked like they had worked every day of her life. Opal had looked at Wren's backpack and her boots, and the way she sat at the counter with her map spread out beside her plate, and she had asked where she was headed. Wren told her. Opal's eyebrows went up. She said she had heard of that old ranger station. She said it had been empty since before she moved to Stanley, and she had moved to Stanley in 1978. She said the trail up to it was not on any of the tourist maps, and she did not know anyone who had been up there in years. She said Wren should be careful. Wren said she would. After lunch, she hitched a ride with a Forest Service ranger who was driving out to check on a work site near the trailhead. His name was Tom Bridger. He was older than he looked, somewhere in his 70s, with a white beard and sun-darkened skin, and the quiet manner of someone who had spent more time in the woods than out of them. He drove a green Forest Service truck with mud on the fenders and a cracked windshield and a faded bumper sticker that said, "Leave no trace." They did not talk much during the drive. Tom was not the talking type. But when they reached the trailhead where the paved road ended and the forest road began, he pulled over and looked at Wren with something in his eyes that might have been recognition. He looked at her gear, her boots, the way she shouldered her pack without adjusting the straps, like she had done it 1,000 times before. He said, "You know what you're doing." It was not a question. Wren said she did. Tom nodded. Then he said something that made her stop. He said, "That cabin you're going to, it used to belong to a man named Josiah Hartwell. He was the district ranger up there for 13 years, from 58 to 71. Wren waited. Tom looked out at the mountains. He said, Josiah disappeared in the winter of 71, right before they closed the station. Some people say he went up to Alaska to take another posting. Some people say he never left these mountains at all. Wren asked what he meant. Tom shook his head. He said, "I don't know what I mean. I was just a kid back then, but I remember the search parties. I remember people talking about it for years afterward. They never found him. They never found anything." He looked at Wren. He said, "You be careful up there." Wren said she would. She got out of the truck and shouldered her pack and started walking. The forest road climbed gradually through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, switchbacking up the side of a long valley. The snow had melted from the road, but still lay in patches in the shaded areas, dirty and granular, the last remnants of a hard winter. Wren walked at a steady pace, about 1.5 miles per hour. She had learned that pace from her time on the trail crew. It was the pace you could maintain all day without exhausting yourself. The pace that let you cover distance without burning out. She passed 2 creek crossings where simple log bridges had been built by trail crews years ago. At each crossing, she stopped to filter water and rest her shoulders and listen to the sound of the water moving over stones. She passed a Forest Service work site that had been closed for the season. The equipment locked in a small shed. The ground around it scarred by tire tracks and boot prints that were already filling in with new growth. She passed an old burn area from a fire that had swept through decades ago. The dead trees stood silver gray against the sky, their bark stripped away by years of weather. Their branches broken off until only the trunks remained. But at their bases, new growth was coming up. Small pines and wildflowers and grasses reaching for the light that the dead trees had opened up. The mountains were always doing this, burning down and growing back, dying and being reborn. Wren made camp that night at the base of the pass, in a small flat clearing beside a creek that was still partially frozen. She set up her tent and cooked a simple dinner on her small stove, rice and beans and a handful of dried fruit, the last of the food she had bought in Stanley. After dinner, she sat on a rock beside the creek and watched the stars come out. One by one, they appeared. First, the brightest ones, the planets Venus and Jupiter, low on the horizon. Then the dimmer ones, filling in the darkness like someone was turning on lights in a vast and empty house. The Milky Way emerged, a river of light stretching from horizon to horizon. And Wren tilted her head back and looked at it and felt the same thing she had felt every time she looked at the night sky since she was a child. Small. Small and temporary and unimportant, but also part of something. Part of all of it. Part of the rocks and the trees and the water and the stars and the darkness between them. It was cold that night. Below freezing by midnight. But Wren was used to cold. She wore her thermal underwear inside her sleeping bag and put her water bottle inside the bag with her so it would not freeze, and slept the deep, heavy sleep of someone whose body had been working all day and was grateful for the rest. When she woke at dawn, frost was thick on the outside of her sleeping bag. Her breath made clouds in the cold air. The eastern sky was the color of pale rose behind the dark granite ridge above her. She packed up camp and started climbing. The trail to the pass was steep, switchbacking up a north-facing slope that still held significant patches of late-season snow. In some places, the snow was deep enough that she had to kick steps into it, plunging her boots into the crust and stomping down to create footholds. In other places, the snow had melted and refrozen into hard ice, and she had to move carefully using her trekking poles for balance testing each step before she committed her weight to it. She stopped twice to drink water and once to eat a granola bar. She did not stop to rest. She did not need to. Her body was built for this. 2 years of seasonal work and weekend hiking had made her strong in a way that didn't show. She was lean and wiry, and her legs could climb all day without complaint. The pass was at 7,200 feet. It was a narrow gap between 2 granite peaks. A place where the wind always blew, where the snow lingered until late June and returned again in early September. When Wren reached it, she was breathing hard, and her legs were burning and sweat had soaked through her base layer despite the cold. She stopped at the top and turned around and looked back the way she had come. Mountains, nothing but mountains. The valley she had walked through the day before was a green ribbon far below the creek, a silver thread winding through it. Beyond the valley, more ridges, more peaks, more wilderness stretching away to the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a line so clean and sharp it looked like it had been drawn with a knife. She turned and looked the other way. More mountains. A different valley, this one broader, filled with lodgepole pine and aspen. The aspens were just beginning to leaf out their new growth. A brilliant pale green against the dark conifers, like thousands of small lanterns held up against the shadows. And somewhere down there, invisible from where she stood, was the cabin. Her cabin. The place she had been looking at on maps since she was 8 years old. Wren started down. The descent was easier than the climb. The south-facing slope had less snow, and the trail was clearer, winding down through subalpine meadows where the first wildflowers of the season were appearing. Glacier lilies with their yellow petals bent back like wings. Spring beauties white with pink stripes. Pasque flowers in their fuzzy purple-gray clusters blooming before the snow had even finished melting around them. She made good time. By mid-afternoon, she was walking through the lodgepole pine forest. The trees tall and straight around her, their lower trunks bare for the first 20 feet, the way lodgepoles always grew, reaching for the sun, competing with their neighbors for light, growing up and up and up until their crowns finally broke through and spread out against the sky. She crossed another creek on a log bridge that looked like it had been built decades ago and never maintained since. The logs were gray and weathered but still solid. She tested them before crossing, bouncing on her heels, feeling the wood give slightly but not break. She climbed a small ridge, and then she saw it. The cabin sat in a clearing on a flat shelf of land above a creek. It was built of dark stained logs, single story with a steep green metal roof designed to shed snow. A small covered porch fronted the south side. A stone chimney rose from the west wall. 3 windows on the front, 2 on each side. A simple wooden door painted faded brown. Above the door there was a small carved wooden sign. The lettering on it was too weathered to read from where she stood. Behind the cabin, partially visible through the trees, was a tall wooden structure. A fire lookout tower, about 60 feet tall with a small enclosed cab at the top and a switchback ladder running up the side. The tower was leaning slightly, but it was still standing, still watching over the valley the way it had been watching for almost 100 years. Wren stood at the edge of the clearing and did not move. The light was the color of late copper. The lodgepole pines around the clearing stood tall and straight, their shadows stretching toward the east. A cold breeze came down off the ridge and moved through the treetops, making them sway slowly, gently, like they were nodding to her. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. The sound carried impossibly far in the thin mountain air. This was it. This was the place. The place she had been looking at on maps for 13 years, ever since she was a small girl, sitting on a kitchen floor with an atlas in her lap, tracing the green spaces with her finger, telling her mother that she was looking at where she was going to live someday. Her mother had thought it was a phase. It was not a phase. Wren walked across the clearing to the cabin. The grass was tall and brown from the winter, but she could see the remnants of a path worn into the ground, a path that led from the edge of the trees to the porch steps. a path that had been walked thousands of times by the man who had lived here before her, the man named Josiah Hartwell, who had disappeared in the winter of 1971 and had never been found. The porch boards creaked under her boots. She tried the door handle, locked, but the lock was old, and the wood around it was soft from decades of weather and neglect. When she put her shoulder against the door and pushed, firmly the latch gave with a small splintering sound, and the door swung inward. Inside was darkness. Inside was dust. Inside was 53 years of silence. Wren stepped across the threshold and into the cabin, into her new life. The cabin was a single large room about 20 feet by 30 feet. The floor was rough-cut pine planks, dark with age, but solid under her feet. The walls were the same dark logs as the exterior, the chink in between them mostly intact. Only a few gaps near the corners where the daubing had crumbled away. The ceiling was open to the rafters with a loft area at one end accessible by a wooden ladder. The loft had a railing made of peeled pine poles, and she could see the end of what looked like a mattress up there, gray with dust. A stone fireplace dominated the west wall. Its mantel was rough cut from a single piece of timber, dark and worn smooth by years of hands resting on it. The hearth was made of flat creek stones fitted together without mortar, and the firebox was black with old soot. Beside the fireplace stood a wood cook stove. Cast iron, its surface rusted in places, but the firebox intact. The kind of stove that people had cooked on for 100 years before electricity made them obsolete. Furniture had been left behind. A heavy wooden table in the center of the room with 2 chairs pushed under it. A simple cot frame against the back wall, its canvas rotted away, but its wooden frame still sound. A bookshelf along the east wall, empty now, but still standing. A small writing desk under one of the front windows positioned to catch the morning light. A coat rack by the door with 3 iron hooks. Everything was covered in dust. A thick layer of gray that muted every surface, that filled every corner, that hung in the air and sparkled in the light coming through the dirty windows. Everything looked exactly as it had when the last person walked out. In 1971, 53 years ago, Wren walked slowly through the room, leaving footprints in the dust on the floor. She touched the table, ran her fingers across its surface, leaving trails in the gray. She looked at the stove, the fireplace, the windows with their wavy old glass. She looked at the loft, the ladder, the bookshelf waiting to be filled. She looked at all of it. And then she saw the cabinet. It was in the corner of the room beside the bookshelf. A metal cabinet, gray steel, about 4 feet tall. The kind of cabinet the Forest Service used to issue to its district stations for storing maps and documents and supplies. It had 2 doors with a built-in lock, and the doors were closed. There was a faded inventory number stamped on the front, and the lock was still intact. Wren walked to the cabinet and tried the handle. Locked. She looked around the room. She looked at the door she had come through, at the coat rack beside it, at the 3 iron hooks. And then she looked up. Above the door, hanging from a small nail, was a metal ring with 3 keys on it. 2 of the keys were old skeleton keys, the kind that fit door locks from another era. The third was a small steel key, the kind that fit a filing cabinet or a metal storage cabinet. Wren took the ring down and walked back to the cabinet. She tried the small steel key in the lock. It turned. The lock clicked open. Wren stood there for a moment, her hand on the handle, the key still in the lock. She did not know what was inside. She did not know what Josiah Hartwell had left behind when he walked out of this cabin 53 years ago and disappeared into the mountains. But she was about to find out. She pulled the doors open, and her life changed forever. The cabinet doors swung open with a groan of old hinges. Inside was a treasure. Maps. Hundreds of maps. They were stacked on the shelves in neat piles organized by region, each one folded carefully along its original creases. Topographic maps, fire boundary maps, trail maps, hand-drawn route maps on yellowed paper, survey maps with precise measurements and careful notations in faded pencil. Wren reached out and touched the edge of the nearest stack. The paper was old, but sound protected by the sealed cabinet from the moisture and temperature swings that had aged everything else in the cabin. She pulled out the top map and unfolded it carefully. It was a USGS topographic survey from 1934. Original printing. The kind of map that collectors paid hundreds of dollars for. The kind of map that belonged in a museum or a university archive, not in an abandoned cabin 14 miles from the nearest road. She put it back and pulled out another, a hand-corrected fire response map from 1947. Someone had drawn on it in red pencil, marking fire lines and evacuation routes and water sources. The handwriting was neat and precise, the work of someone who understood that lives might depend on the accuracy of those marks. Another map, a trail system proposal from 1952, showing routes that had never been built, possibilities that had been abandoned when funding ran out or priorities changed. Another, a geological survey from 1939 marking mineral deposits and fault lines and underground water sources. Wren went through the stacks one by one, unfolding each map, examining it, refolding it along the same creases. The collection was extraordinary. Decades of cartographic history preserved in this metal cabinet, in this abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. She was so absorbed in the maps that she almost missed what was on the bottom shelf. Almost. But then her hand brushed against something that was not paper. Something soft. Something heavy. She pushed aside the last stack of maps and looked down. There were 3 canvas bags on the bottom shelf tucked behind the map collection. Each one was tied with twine, the knots tight and deliberate. They had been placed there carefully, intentionally, hidden behind the maps, like someone wanted them to be found only by a person who was patient enough to look through everything else first. Wren lifted the first bag. It was heavy, much heavier than she expected. She set it on the floor of the cabin and knelt beside it in the dust and the fading light. Her fingers worked at the knot, which was stiff with age, but not impossible. The twine loosened. The bag opened. Inside was money. Old paper money. 20s and 50s bound in stacks with paper bands, the way banks used to ban currency. Each stack was labeled with a year written in the same neat handwriting she had seen on the fire response map. 1962, 1963, 1964. Wren stared at the money. She did not touch it. She did not count it. She just stared. Then she opened the second bag. More money, more stacks, more paper bands with years written on them. 1965, 1966, 1967, 1968. The third bag was the same, 1969, 1970, 1971. Wren sat back on her heels and looked at the 3 open bags arranged on the floor in front of her. The bills were old. Their colors faded, their edges soft from years of storage. But they were real. They were money. They were a fortune sitting in canvas bags in an abandoned cabin that she had bought for $10. She started counting. It took her almost an hour. The light faded as she worked, the sun dropping behind the western ridge, the cabin filling with shadows. She did not stop to light a candle or start a fire. She just counted stack by stack, year by year, separating the 20s from the 50s and keeping a running total in her head. When she finished, she sat on the dusty floor with her back against the wall and looked at the piles of money spread out in front of her. $39,800, almost $40,000 in old bills organized by year from 1958 to 1971. 13 years of savings. 13 years of a man's life converted into paper and stored in canvas bags and locked in a metal cabinet and left behind when he walked out of this cabin for the last time. Wren did not understand. She did not understand why anyone would leave almost $40,000 in an abandoned building. She did not understand why Josiah Hartwell had not taken his money with him when he left. She did not understand any of it. And then she saw the portfolio. It was at the very back of the cabinet behind where the bags had been. A leather portfolio, dark brown, its surface cracked and aged but still holding together. She had missed it in the shadows. Wren reached into the cabinet and pulled it out. The portfolio was tied with a leather cord. She untied it and opened the cover. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A letter, typed on Forest Service letterhead, dated June 30th, 1971. Wren carried the letter to the window where the last light of day was still coming through. She held it up and began to read. To the next person who finds this cabin, my name is Josiah Hartwell. I have served as the district ranger of this station since 1958, when I was 27 years old. For 13 years, this cabin has been my home and these mountains have been my responsibility. I have kept the trails maintained and the fire roads cleared and the lookout tower in working order. I have buried the dead from 3 search and rescue operations and helped birth 1 child whose mother miscalculated her due date and her hiking distance. I've watched the seasons change from this porch more times than I can count. I've loved this country with the kind of love that does not require explanation. The Forest Service is closing this station next month as part of a consolidation. They have offered me a desk job in Salmon. I have declined. I am told that I am moving to Alaska to take a position on the Tongass National Forest. That is what the paperwork says. That is what I have told my supervisors. That is what the official record will show. But I do not know if I will ever leave these mountains. I have thought about it for a long time. I have thought about what it means to love a place so deeply that you cannot imagine existing without it. I have thought about what happens to a man when the only home he has ever known is taken from him by bureaucrats who have never set foot on this trail, who have never watched the sun rise over these peaks, who have never understood what it means to belong somewhere. I do not blame them. They are doing their jobs. They are making decisions based on numbers and budgets and efficiency reports. They do not know what they are destroying, but I know. And I have decided that the mountains will make the final choice. Over the years, I have saved a portion of my paycheck in cash every month and stored it in this cabinet with the maps. I never spent much. The cabin was free. The food was mostly what I caught or grew. The only thing I bought regularly was coffee. The money accumulated. I am leaving it here. I am not leaving it for the Forest Service. They have decided this place is no longer worth their attention, and I disagree. And I will not reward that decision by giving them my savings. I am leaving it for whoever finds this cabin next. If the Forest Service sells it, it will go to whoever buys it. If a hiker breaks in and finds it, it will go to that hiker. If the cabin sits empty for 100 years and then burns down in a wildfire, the money will burn with the building. That is acceptable to me. What I want is for the money to belong to someone who values this place. Anyone who walks 14 miles to get here, and who opens a Forest Service cabinet with the key I left hanging by the door, has earned the right to whatever I have left behind. I will not be the person to decide who that is. I will trust the mountains to decide the way I have trusted them for 13 years. Take care of the cabin if you can. The roof is good for another 20 years if you keep the snow cleared off it. The chimney needs repointing. The lookout tower is structurally sound, but the cab needs new windows. Do not climb it in high wind. The west window of the cabin sticks in damp weather. Push on the upper left corner while you lift. There is a spring 200 feet north of the cabin, behind a large boulder that is shaped like a turtle. The water is clean and cold and has never run dry in all the years I have been here. This place taught me everything I know about being alive. I hope it teaches you too. Josiah Hartwell, June 30th, 1971. Wren read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the leather portfolio and tied the cord and set the portfolio on the table beside the piles of money. She walked outside and stood on the porch and looked at the mountains. The sun had set. The sky was the color of bruised plums, purple and blue and gray, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge. The air was cold and still, and smelled of pine and snow and something else. Something she could not name. Something that might have been time itself. The lodgepole pines stood black against the fading sky. The lookout tower rose behind the cabin like a sentinel, watching over the valley the way it had watched for almost a century. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Wren stood on that porch for a long time. She thought about Josiah Hartwell. She thought about a man who had loved this place so much that he could not imagine leaving it. A man who had saved his money for 13 years and left it all behind for a stranger to find. A man who had trusted the mountains to decide who would come next. She thought about her mother Marlene, who had found her sitting on the kitchen floor with a road atlas in her lap and had thought it was a phase. She thought about all the miles she had walked to get here. She thought about the $10 she had spent. And then she said out loud to the darkness and the stars and the mountains and the ghost of a man she had never met, "I'm gonna take care of it." Her voice was small in the vastness of the night. But she meant it. She meant it more than she had ever meant anything. Wren spent the first night sleeping on the floor of the cabin in her sleeping bag, surrounded by the dust and silence of 53 years. She did not light a fire. She was not ready yet. She wanted to spend the first night the way Josiah might have spent his first night in 1958, before he made the cabin his own. She lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the night, the wind moving through the pine trees outside, the creak of old wood settling, the distant call of an owl hunting in the meadow, the profound and absolute silence that existed beneath all of it, the silence of a place so far from other people that there was no human sound at all. Just the world as it had always been. She slept deeply. In the morning, she woke to light streaming through the dirty windows and the sound of birds singing in the trees outside. She lay in her sleeping bag for a moment, looking up at the rafters, watching the dust motes float in the sunbeams. Then she got up and began to make the cabin hers. She started by walking the property. She found the spring 200 feet north of the cabin, behind a large boulder that was indeed shaped like a turtle. The resemblance was unmistakable. The boulder had a domed top and a narrower section that looked like a head, and it sat at the base of a small slope where water seeped up from underground and collected in a natural basin before spilling over and running down toward the creek. The water was clear and cold and tasted faintly of stone. She found the woodshed behind the cabin. It was half collapsed, the roof fallen in on one side, but the other side was still standing, and inside were several cords of firewood that Josiah had cut and stacked over 50 years ago. Lodgepole pines split and seasoned dry as bone after half a century of sitting undisturbed, ready to burn. She found the outhouse still standing, its walls intact, its seat worn smooth by years of use. The pit had long since composted into dark, rich soil that smelled like earth and nothing else. She found the lookout tower. It stood 60 feet tall, its wooden frame weathered but sound. The ladder that switchbacked up the side was missing a few rungs, but most of them were still there, and the structure itself did not sway or creak when she put her weight on it. She climbed carefully, testing each rung before committing to it, pausing every 10 feet to look down at the ground receding below her. At the top was a small enclosed cab, about 10 feet square, with windows on all 4 sides. The windows were dirty but unbroken. The floor was covered with old leaves and bird droppings, but it was solid. There was a small table built into one wall, and a chair that had fallen over and a pair of binoculars hanging from a hook. Wren stood in the center of the cab and looked out. The view was beyond anything she had ever seen. Mountains in every direction. 80 miles of visibility on this clear spring morning. 80 miles of peaks and valleys and forests and meadows and rivers winding through it all like silver ribbons. 80 miles of wilderness of country that had looked the same for 10,000 years before anyone built anything in it. No roads, no buildings, no power lines, no cell towers. Just the world. Just the world as it was supposed to be. Wren stood in that lookout cab for almost an hour without moving. And then she started crying. Not because she was sad, because she had spent her entire life looking at maps and dreaming of standing exactly where she was standing right now. Because she had not believed until this moment that the dream could actually be real. Because her mother was dead and her father was gone, and she had no family and no money and no future that she could see. But she had this. She had this cabin and this tower and this view and this silence and this place that had been waiting for her since before she was born. The world had not given her many things in 21 years, but it had given her this. And this was enough. This was more than enough. Over the following weeks, Wren made the cabin livable. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees with water she carried from the spring. In an old bucket she found in the woodshed, she scraped the grime off the windows with a piece of broken glass, working carefully so as not to crack the old panes. She swept the cobwebs from the corners and the dust from the rafters and the mouse droppings from the shelves. She replaced the chinking in the worst gaps between the logs, mixing mud and grass and water into a paste and pressing it into the cracks with her fingers. It was not pretty work, but it was effective. The drafts stopped. She cleaned the wood cook stove, scraping out decades of rust and creosote and old ash. She found that the firebox was intact and the damper still worked. And the stovepipe, though corroded in places, was still sound enough to draw smoke up and out of the cabin. She cleaned the fireplace, too, reaching up into the flue to pull out nests and debris, scraping the soot from the stone with a flat rock until the surface was clean enough to see the individual stones again. She lit her first fire on the third night. She used the 50-year-old firewood from Josiah's woodshed, and it caught immediately, the dry pine burning hot and bright and filling the cabin with warmth and light and the smell of wood smoke. She sat in one of the old chairs beside the fire and watched the flames dance and listened to the wood pop and crack and thought about the man who had stacked that firewood half a century ago, the man who had lived in this cabin for 13 years, the man who had walked away and left everything behind. She wondered where he had gone. She wondered if he had really gone to Alaska. She wondered if the mountains had made the final choice the way he said they would. She wondered if she would ever know. The supply runs began. Every 2 weeks, Wren would leave the cabin at dawn and walk the 6 miles down the trail to the forest road. Then the 8 miles down the forest road to the trailhead, where she had stashed her bicycle locked to a tree. She would ride the bike the last few miles to the parking area, where a shuttle van made a weekly stop in summer. And she would catch the shuttle into Stanley. In Stanley, she would do her shopping at the general store. She would buy the things she had learned she actually needed, which was less than she had thought. Salt, coffee, flour, beans, rice, dried fruit, cooking oil, soap, toothpaste, batteries for her headlamp, books from the small used bookstore on Main Street, which had a free trade box on the porch where you could swap one paperback for another. She would eat a hot meal at Opal's diner. After her third visit, Opal started making her usual order without being asked. Cheeseburger, medium rare with fries and a chocolate milkshake. And Opal started saving the local paper for her a weekly publication that was mostly advertisements and obituaries, but that kept Wren connected in a small way to the world beyond the mountains. After her 5th visit, Opal started asking questions, not prying questions. Just the kind of questions one person asks another when they are curious and care. Where are you from? How did you end up here? What is it like living up there alone? Wren answered some of the questions and not others. She told Opal about her mother dying. She told her about the listing on the Forest Service website. She told her about walking 14 miles over a 7,000-foot pass with everything she owned on her back. She did not tell her about the money. She did not tell anyone about the money. The money was between her and Josiah and the mountains, and it was not anyone else's business. After her shopping was done, Wren would catch the shuttle back to the parking area. She would ride the bike back to the trailhead. She would lock it to the same tree. And then she would walk the 14 miles uphill, carrying everything she had bought, watching the mountains grow larger and closer with every step. Each trip taught her something. She learned what she actually needed, which was less than she had thought. She learned how to pack efficiently, balancing weight and bulk and necessity. She learned that dried beans were better than canned because they weighed less. She learned that powdered milk was better than fresh because it did not spoil. She learned that books were worth the wait because the nights were long and the silence was deep and the mind needed something to do. She brought up a sleeping pad for the cot. She rolled it and strapped it to her pack frame and carried it 14 miles uphill. And it took her 2 days because she could not make the full distance with that much weight. She had to camp halfway at the base of the pass, and her shoulders ached for a week afterward. But it was worth it. Everything was worth it. In June, she sold 6 of the maps. She had inventoried Josiah's collection carefully, unfolding each map, checking its condition, noting its date and type and rarity. Most of them were valuable. A few of them were extraordinary. She contacted a map dealer in Boise through a letter she mailed from Stanley. The dealer wrote back expressing interest. She mailed him photographs of the maps she was willing to sell. He wrote back with an offer, $11,000 for 6 maps. She accepted. The money arrived as a cashier's check, care of the general store in Stanley where she had arranged to receive mail. She deposited it in a bank account she opened in town, a small account at a small bank where no one asked questions about a young woman with dirt under her fingernails and sun on her face and the smell of wood smoke in her hair. The money changed things, not her life. Her life was already what she wanted it to be. But the money changed the edges of that life, made them softer, made them less precarious. She bought a small solar panel and a battery system. She carried them in over 3 trips, each trip harder than the last, but worth it. Now she had light after dark. Now she could charge a small radio that picked up stations from Boise on clear nights. She bought a propane camp stove for summer cooking, so she did not have to light the wood stove when the cabin was already warm. She bought books. So many books. Field guides to birds and plants and mushrooms. History books about the region. Novels by writers she loved and writers she had never heard of. Wilderness writings. Murie, Olson, Abbey, Austin, Leopold, Dillard, Lopez. She built a library on the bookshelf along the east wall. Filling it volume by volume, each book carried 14 miles on her back, each book earned. By the end of her first year, she had over 200 books on that shelf, and she had read most of them. She fixed the chimney in August. She carried cement in from town in 2 trips, 20 pounds each trip, mixing it with sand she dug from the creek bank and water from the spring. She stood on a ladder she built from lodgepole poles and repointed the mortar between the stones, filling the gaps where 50 years of weather had worn it away. She replaced the broken porch boards with new lumber she split from a fallen lodgepole, using a wedge and a maul she found in the woodshed. The rough split planks were not as smooth as milled lumber, but they matched the rest of the cabin. They belonged. She repaired the woodshed roof with cedar shakes she split by hand from a fallen tree. She found half a mile down the trail. She spent 3 days on that project, working in the cool shade of the forest, splitting shake after shake after shake, carrying them back to the cabin in bundles, nailing them to the roof one by one. She cleaned the lookout tower windows with vinegar and newspaper rubbing in circles until the glass was clear enough to see through without distortion. She climbed to the cab on clear afternoons and sat in the old chair and looked at the view. 80 miles of wilderness. 80 miles of the world as it was before. Some days she stayed up there for hours watching the shadows move across the valleys, watching the weather come in from the west, watching the sun set and the stars emerge and the moon rise over the mountains. She never got tired of that view. She did not think she ever would. She saw no one for 47 days, not because she was hiding, not because she was avoiding people, but because no one came. The trail to the cabin was not on any modern hiking map. The Forest Service had stopped maintaining it decades ago. The only people who knew about it were old-timers who remembered the ranger station from before it closed, and most of them were gone now. She saw wildlife instead. A black bear came through the clearing in May, a big male with a shaggy coat looking for early spring shoots in the meadow. Wren watched from the porch as he ambled through the tall grass, turning over rocks, sniffing the air. He saw her. He looked at her for a long moment, his small eyes curious but not afraid. Then he went back to his foraging, ignoring her completely. A great gray owl began roosting in a large pine near the cabin. She saw it most evenings at dusk, sitting on a branch watching the meadow with its huge yellow eyes. When it flew, it made no sound at all. It simply lifted off the branch and glided across the meadow and dropped onto something in the grass and rose again with its prey in its talons. She saw deer and elk and coyotes and foxes. She saw eagles and hawks and a family of pine martens that lived in a hollow tree near the creek. She saw a moose, once a cow with a calf, standing in the shallow water of the creek drinking. The animals were her neighbors. They were the only company she needed. She started keeping a journal. She had never been a writer. She had never kept a diary or written letters or put her thoughts on paper. But the cabin seemed to want a record. The silence seemed to want a voice. She wrote about the weather, the first hard frost in September, the way the morning fog filled the valley and burned off by noon, the sound of thunder rolling across the peaks. She wrote about the wildlife, the bear in the meadow, the owl at dusk, the way the elk bugled in the fall, their calls echoing off the mountains. She wrote about the light, the way it changed through the day from the pale pink of dawn to the golden warmth of midday, to the deep orange of sunset, the way it looked different in every season, softer in summer, harder in winter, always beautiful. She wrote about Josiah Hartwell. She wrote about the letter he had left behind, about the money and the maps and the trust he had placed in the mountains to choose his successor. She wondered what he would think if he could see her now living in his cabin, reading his letter by firelight, carrying on the work he had started. She hoped he would be pleased. She hoped the mountains had chosen well. By the 4th month, the cabin was a home in every sense that mattered. Food in the cupboards, a fire in the stove, books on the shelves, boots by the door, maps on the table, the smell of coffee in the morning and wood smoke at night. Wren had developed a routine that fit the place. Early mornings doing chores around the cabin, carrying water from the spring, splitting firewood, checking the traps she had learned to set for rabbits and squirrels, mid-mornings hiking or working on a project. There was always something to fix, something to improve, something to build. Afternoons reading or writing in her journal, sitting on the porch if the weather was good beside the fire, if it was not. Evenings cooking on the wood stove and watching the light change through the windows. Eating simple meals at the heavy wooden table. Washing dishes in a basin of water heated on the stove. She slept hard at night the way you sleep when you have been physical all day, and there is no electricity to keep you awake past sundown. She was alone. But she was not lonely. There is a difference. In September, visitors came. The first was a retired biology professor from Bozeman, a man in his 70s who was doing a survey of subalpine fungi. He had been coming to these mountains for 40 years, he said, and he had heard about the old ranger station from a guidebook published in 1965. He had always wanted to see it. Wren made him coffee and let him sit on the porch and look at the lookout tower and the meadow. He stayed for 2 hours and then hiked out. Before he left, he gave her his card and told her to write if she ever needed anything. The second was a solo thru-hiker, a young woman about Wren's age who was walking a self-designed route from Yellowstone to the Sawtooths. She was thin and strong and had the hollow look of someone who had been on the trail for weeks. Wren fed her dinner and let her sleep on the porch and sent her off in the morning with extra food from her stores. The third was a pair of young men in their 20s who had inherited a map from their grandfather and were retracing his 1962 elk hunting route. They had not expected to find anyone at the cabin. They had not expected the cabin to still be standing. They stayed for an afternoon asking questions about what it was like to live out here, looking at Wren with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. She told them the short version of her story, her mother dying, the listing on the Forest Service website, the $10, the 14-mile walk. She did not tell them about the money. She did not tell them about the letter. Some things were not for sharing. They listened with the kind of attention that backcountry travelers give to stories that explain things they are still trying to figure out. Things about solitude and purpose and what it means to find a place where you belong. When they left, one of them turned back and said, "You're lucky, you know, to have found this." Wren nodded. She said, "I know." But luck was not the right word. The mountains had decided. The mountains always decided. That was what Josiah had understood. That was what he had trusted. And now Wren understood it too. She understood that she had not found this cabin by accident. She had not stumbled onto it through random chance. She had walked here. She had walked 14 miles over a 7,000-foot pass with everything she owned on her back. She had pushed open a locked door and searched a dusty room and found a key and opened a cabinet and discovered a fortune that a dead man had left behind for whoever came next. The mountains had tested her, and she had passed. She sat on the porch one evening in late September and watched the sunset over the western ridge. The aspens in the meadow had turned gold. The lodgepoles stood dark green against the pale autumn sky. The first dusting of snow had appeared on the highest peaks the night before. and the air had the smell of cold coming. The smell that means winter is no longer a future event, but a present arrival. Wren thought about the months ahead. She thought about the snow that would fall and fall and fall, covering the cabin, covering the trails, cutting her off from the rest of the world for 6 months or more. She thought about the cold and the darkness and the silence. She was not afraid. She was ready. She had spent her whole life getting ready for this. Every mile she had hiked, every book she had read, every night she had spent alone in a tent in the mountains listening to the wind and the rain and her own heartbeat. It had all been preparation. It had all been leading here, to this cabin, to this view, to this life. Winter came early that year. The first real snow fell in the 3rd week of October. Wren woke in the darkness before dawn to a silence so complete that she knew something had changed. She lay in her sleeping bag on the cot and listened, and what she heard was nothing. No wind in the pines, no creek running over stones, no birds calling in the trees, just silence. The deep, muffled silence of snow. She got up and opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch in her wool socks and long underwear. The world had been transformed. 6 inches of fresh powder covered everything, turning the meadow into a white blanket, weighing down the branches of the lodgepole pines, softening every edge and corner until the landscape looked like something from a dream. The sky was the color of iron. More snow was coming. Wren stood on the porch and watched her breath make clouds in the cold air and felt something she had not expected to feel. Joy. Pure and simple joy. This was what she had been waiting for. Not the easy months of summer when the trails were clear and the sun was warm and she could walk to town in a single long day. But this, the hard months, the months when she would be truly alone, truly cut off, truly dependent on nothing but herself and the supplies she had stored and the skills she had learned. This was the test, and she was ready. She had spent the fall preparing. The woodshed was full. She had cut and split and stacked enough firewood to last until spring, working for hours every day, swinging the maul until her shoulders ached, carrying armloads of split pine from the chopping block to the shed until she could not carry any more. The wood was stacked in neat rows, each row a different length, organized so that she could find kindling in small pieces and large pieces without having to dig through the whole pile. The cabin was weatherproofed. She had replaced the chinking in every gap, caulked around. Every window hung a heavy blanket over the door to keep out drafts. She had cleaned the chimney and the stovepipe and tested the damper, and made sure that the fire would draw properly even in the deepest cold. The pantry was stocked. 50 pounds of rice, 40 pounds of beans, 20 pounds of flour, sugar and salt and coffee and tea, dried fruit and nuts and honey and maple syrup, canned vegetables and canned fish and powdered milk and powdered eggs. Enough food to last until the snow melted and the trails opened again. She had books. She had paper and pencils for writing. She had a deck of cards and a chess set she had found in the general store in Stanley, though she did not know who she would play chess against. She had everything she needed. Now all she had to do was survive. The snow kept falling. By the end of October, there were 2 feet on the ground. By mid-November, 3 feet. By December, the drifts against the north side of the cabin were over her head. and she had to dig a path from the door to the woodshed every morning just to get fuel for the fire. The days were short. The sun rose late and set early, and the light in between was thin and gray, filtered through clouds that never seemed to lift. Some days she did not see the sun at all. Some days the clouds hung so low that she could not see the top of the lookout tower, just its base disappearing into the whiteness like it was being swallowed by the sky. The nights were long, 14 hours of darkness, 15, 16. The longest night of the year lasted nearly 17 hours, and Wren spent it sitting beside the fire, feeding it logs, watching the flames, listening to the wind howl outside. The cold was brutal. In January, the temperature dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks. The air was so cold that it hurt to breathe. The snow squeaked under her boots like styrofoam. The trees cracked and popped in the night as the sap inside them froze and expanded. Wren learned to keep the fire burning all night. She learned to wake every few hours to add wood to check the damper to make sure the cabin was not filling with smoke. She learned to dress in layers even inside, wearing her wool sweater and her down vest and her hat with the ear flaps, because the corners of the cabin were always cold no matter how hot the fire burned. She learned to melt snow for water when the spring froze over. She learned to keep a bucket of snow beside the stove at all times, letting it melt slowly, so she always had water for drinking and cooking and washing. She learned to ration her food, not because she was running out, but because she did not know how long the winter would last, and she wanted to be prepared for anything. She learned to live with the silence. That was the hardest part. The silence of winter in the mountains was not like any silence she had ever known. It was not the silence of a quiet room or a sleeping house or a library after closing. It was the silence of a world that had stopped moving. The silence of a place where nothing happened, where nothing changed, where time itself seemed to have frozen along with everything else. Some days she did not speak a single word out loud. Some days she went from waking to sleeping without hearing any human voice, including her own. The silence pressed in on her. It filled the cabin like water filling a vessel. It got inside her head. In the 3rd week of January, she started talking to herself. She did not mean to. It just happened. She was cooking dinner one evening, stirring a pot of beans on the stove, and she found herself narrating what she was doing. Adding salt now. Needs more water. Almost ready. She stopped, startled by the sound of her own voice in the quiet cabin. Then she kept going. She talked to herself while she cooked and while she ate and while she washed the dishes afterward. She talked to herself while she read, commenting on the books, arguing with the authors, praising the passages she loved. She talked to herself while she wrote in her journal, speaking the words aloud before she put them on paper. It helped. The sound of a human voice, even her own, pushed back against the silence. It reminded her that she was still alive, still thinking, still present in the world. She started talking to Josiah, too. Not out loud, not exactly. But in her head, she had conversations with him. She told him about her day, about the weather, about the book she was reading. She asked him questions about the cabin, about the mountains, about his life before he came here, and his life while he was here, and what had happened to him after he left. He never answered, of course, but she felt his presence anyway, in the letter he had left behind, in the money he had saved, and the maps he had collected, and the firewood he had stacked in the shed. in the marks his hands had left on every surface of the cabin, the wear patterns on the floor, the smooth spots on the door handle, the soot stains on the ceiling above the stove. He had lived here for 13 years. He had loved this place the way she was learning to love it, and he had trusted the mountains to choose who would come next. She was grateful to him. She was grateful in a way she could not put into words for the gift he had given her. Not just the money, though the money was real and important, but the cabin itself, the proof that someone before her had loved this exact place, the proof that she was not the first person to walk into a wilderness and decide to stay. That was the real gift. The knowledge that she was not alone, not in the deepest sense, not in the sense that mattered. The worst night came in February. She woke in the darkness to the smell of smoke. Not the good smell of wood smoke from the fireplace, the smell she had grown to love over the long winter months. A different smell, thick and acrid. The smell of something wrong. She sat up in bed and saw it immediately. The cabin was filling with smoke, not the thin wisps that sometimes leaked from the stove when the damper was not quite right, but thick gray clouds rolling across the ceiling, blocking out the light from the single candle she kept burning on the table. The chimney was blocked. She had cleaned it in the fall, but something must have fallen into it. A bird maybe seeking shelter from the cold, or a clump of snow that had melted and refrozen and created a dam. The fire was still burning, but the smoke had nowhere to go. It was backing up into the cabin, filling the space, making the air unbreathable. Wren threw off her blankets and stumbled to the stove. Her eyes were watering. Her lungs were burning. She could barely see through the haze. She grabbed the handle of the damper and pulled it closed, cutting off the air supply to the fire. The flames died down, but the smoke kept coming, billowing out from the gaps around the stove door, filling the cabin faster than before. She had to get out. She had to get outside where she could breathe. She pulled on her boots without tying them and grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and pushed outside into the night. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The air was so frigid that it froze the tears on her cheeks and turned the moisture in her nose to ice. She gasped, and the cold air burned her throat. But it was clean. It was breathable. She stood on the porch in her pajamas, and her untied boots and her coat pulled around her shoulders, and she looked back at the cabin. Smoke was pouring out of every crack and gap. It rose into the night sky in a gray column lit from below by the faint glow of the dying fire. If she had not woken up when she did, she would have suffocated in her sleep. She would have died alone in a cabin 14 miles from the nearest road, and no one would have found her body until spring. The thought was terrifying, and also strangely clarifying. She was not going to die. Not tonight. Not like this. She was going to fix the problem. She was going to survive. She went to the woodshed and found the long metal pole she had used to clean the chimney in the fall. She carried it back to the cabin and climbed up onto the porch railing, and from there onto the roof. The roof was covered in snow and ice, slippery and treacherous in the darkness. She moved carefully, testing each step, digging the pole into the snow for balance. The cold was savage. Her fingers were already numb. Her feet were freezing in her unlaced boots. She made it to the chimney. She could see the problem immediately. A massive clump of snow and ice had accumulated on the cap, blocking the opening completely. The fire's heat had melted some of it, but the meltwater had refrozen around the edges, creating a seal that no smoke could penetrate. She raised the pole and swung it at the ice. The impact jarred her arms, but the ice cracked. She swung again, and again, and again. Chunks of ice flew off into the darkness. The cap came loose. She knocked it aside and plunged the pole down into the chimney, breaking up whatever was blocking the flue. A gust of trapped smoke rushed up past her, and she heard the fire in the cabin roar back to life as the air began to flow again. She climbed down from the roof and went back inside. The smoke was clearing, already pulled up the chimney by the restored draft. The fire was burning bright and hot, hungry for the oxygen it had been denied. Wren stood in the middle of the cabin and shook. Not from the cold, though she was colder than she had ever been. From the nearness of it. From how close she had come. She built the fire up high and sat beside it until the shaking stopped. She made coffee and drank it hot and black. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and waited for the warmth to seep back into her bones. And she understood something she had not understood before. This place was not just beautiful. It was dangerous. It was unforgiving. It did not care whether she lived or died. It would not mourn her if she was gone. The mountains did not love her, but she loved them, and that was enough. That was the bargain. You loved a place not because it loved you back, but because it was worthy of love. Because it was beautiful and wild and true. Because it existed outside of human concerns, outside of human time, outside of the small anxieties and petty worries that filled most human lives. You loved it, and you accepted the risks. And if it killed you someday, well, that was part of the bargain too. Josiah had understood that. He had written it in his letter in his own way. He had said that he did not know if he would ever leave these mountains. He had said that the mountains would make the final choice. Maybe they had. Maybe he had walked out into a storm one day. A storm like the one that was howling outside right now. And the mountains had chosen to keep him. Maybe his bones were out there somewhere buried under 50 years of snow and leaves and fallen trees. Maybe he had found peace in that. Wren thought she could find peace in it too. Not tonight. Not for many years yet. But someday. If the mountains chose. Spring came slowly. The snow melted inch by inch, retreating up the slopes, revealing the brown grass and the black earth, and the first green shoots of new growth. The creek began to flow again, freed from its prison of ice. The birds returned, filling the mornings with song. Wren emerged from the cabin like someone emerging from a long illness. She was thinner than she had been in the fall. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her face was pale from months of limited sunlight. But she was alive. She had survived. She walked the property, checking for winter damage. The woodshed had lost a few shakes from its roof. One of the windows on the north side of the cabin had cracked from the cold. The outhouse was leaning more than it had been, the ground beneath it shifted by frost heave. All of it could be fixed. All of it would be fixed. She had time. She had nothing but time. In April, she made her first supply run since October. She walked the 14 miles to the trailhead, her legs weak from months of limited activity, her pack light because she had almost nothing left to carry. The trail was muddy in places, still snowy in others. It took her 2 days instead of 1. Opal was behind the counter at the diner when she walked in. The older woman looked up and saw her and stopped what she was doing. She came around the counter and took Wren's hands in her own and looked at her face. She said, "I didn't know if you'd made it." Wren said, "I made it." Opal nodded. She did not ask questions. She did not demand stories. She just went back behind the counter and started making a cheeseburger and fries and a chocolate milkshake, and when it was ready, she brought it to the table and sat down across from Wren and watched her eat. After a while, Opal said, "You look different." Wren asked how. Opal thought about it. She said, "Older, but not in a bad way. Like you know something now that you didn't know before." Wren thought about that while she ate. She thought about the smoke filling the cabin, the ice on the chimney, the cold that had nearly killed her. She thought about the silence and the solitude and the long nights beside the fire. She thought about Josiah Hartwell and the letter he had left behind, and the trust he had placed in the mountains to choose his successor. She said, "I think I do." Summer came, and with it the visitors, more than the year before. Word was spreading somehow. Hikers and backpackers and curious locals who had heard about the young woman living alone in the old ranger station, 14 miles from the nearest road. They came with questions. What was it like out there? How did she survive the winter? Wasn't she lonely? Wasn't she afraid? Wren answered as best she could. She told them it was quiet. She told them it was hard. She told them she had nearly died in February when the chimney blocked up and the cabin filled with smoke. She told them she was not lonely. She was alone, she said, but that was different. Loneliness was wanting company and not having it. She did not want company. She had the mountains and the trees and the animals and the silence. She had more company than she had ever wanted. She told them she was not afraid. Fear was for people who had something to lose, she said. She had already lost everything. Her mother, her home, her place in the world. She had walked into these mountains with nothing but a backpack and $10. And she had found something she had never expected to find. She had found herself. She had found the place where she belonged. What was there to be afraid of after that? The visitors listened to her answers with the same intent attention the earlier visitors had shown. They were trying to understand something they had not experienced. They were trying to figure out what she had figured out. Most of them left after a few hours. A few stayed overnight, sleeping on the porch, watching the stars, experiencing for one brief moment the silence and solitude that Wren lived with every day. All of them left changed in some small way. Wren could see it in their faces when they said goodbye. A softening, a wondering, a question that they would carry with them back to their lives in towns and cities, back to their jobs and their families and their routines. The question was, what if I did what she did? What if I walked away from everything? What if I found a place like this and never left? Most of them would never answer that question. Most of them would go back to their lives and forget they had ever asked it. The world would close around them again, and the mountains would become a memory. And the question would fade until it was just a vague longing they felt sometimes when they looked at maps or stood on high places or woke in the night to the sound of wind. But a few of them would remember. A few of them would carry the question with them, turning it over in their minds, letting it grow until it became something they could not ignore. And maybe one of them someday would do what Wren had done, would walk into the wilderness and not come back, would find their own cabin, their own silence, their own peace. The mountains were patient. The mountains could wait. In September, on an evening very much like the evening a year before, Wren climbed the lookout tower. She climbed slowly, carefully, the way she always did. The ladder was familiar now. She knew which rungs were loose, which ones to skip, where to put her hands and her feet for the safest ascent. At the top, she pushed open the trap door and climbed into the cab. The windows were clean. She had washed them herself a week ago. The chair was upright, positioned by the west-facing window. The binoculars hung on their hook. She sat down in the chair and looked out. The view was the same as it had always been, the same as it had been when Josiah Hartwell sat in this chair, the same as it had been for 100 years, for 1,000 years, for 10,000 years before anyone built anything here. Mountains. 80 miles of mountains in every direction. The aspens had turned gold again, their leaves trembling in the breeze. The lodgepoles stood dark green against the pale autumn sky. The peaks in the distance were dusted with the first snow of the season, whitecaps on gray stone. Somewhere below, a raven called. The sound carried across the valley and echoed off the peaks and faded into the silence. Wren sat in the lookout tower and looked at the view, and she thought about everything that had brought her here. She thought about her mother, Marlene, who had found her sitting on the kitchen floor with a road atlas in her lap and had thought it was a phase. Marlene had been wrong about that, but maybe she had understood more than she let on. Maybe she had known even then what kind of person her daughter was going to become. Maybe she had spent all those years hoping the world would be gentler with her daughter than it usually was with people who did not fit. The world had not been gentle, but Wren had not needed gentle. She had needed remote. She had needed difficult. She had needed a place that other people had given up on. Because giving up was a privilege of people who had options, and Wren had never had options. She had learned to want what other people threw away. She thought about Josiah Hartwell, the man who had lived in this cabin for 13 years and had loved it with the kind of love that does not require explanation. The man who had saved his money and left it behind and trusted the mountains to choose who would come next. He had been right to trust them. The mountains had chosen. They had chosen her. She thought about the letter he had written. The letter she had read so many times that she had memorized it. The letter that ended with the words, "This place taught me everything I know about being alive. I hope it teaches you too." It had taught her. It was still teaching her. Every day in 1,000 small ways, the cabin and the mountains and the silence were teaching her things she had not known she needed to learn. They were teaching her patience. The patience to wait for the seasons to change, for the snow to melt, for the wildflowers to bloom. They were teaching her humility. The humility to accept that she was small and temporary and unimportant, a brief flicker of consciousness in a universe that had existed for billions of years and would continue to exist long after she was gone. They were teaching her gratitude, the gratitude to appreciate every sunrise and every sunset, every meal cooked on the old stove every night, spent beside the fire, with a book in her lap, and the sound of wind in the pines. They were teaching her love, not the love that wants something in return, not the love that grasps and clings and fears losing what it has, but a different kind of love, a love that gives without expectation, a love that exists simply because its object is worthy of being loved. That was what Josiah had understood. That was what he had written about in his letter, even if he had not used those exact words. You loved a place not because it loved you back. You loved it because it was beautiful, because it was wild, because it was true. Wren sat in the lookout tower as the sun went down. She watched the shadows lengthen across the valleys. She watched the light turn from gold to orange to red to purple. She watched the first stars appear above the eastern peaks, faint at first, then brighter, then blazing in the darkness. The Milky Way emerged, a river of light stretching from horizon to horizon. The same river of light she had looked at as a child. The same river of light that humans had been looking at since the beginning of humanity. She was part of it. She was part of all of it. The mountains and the trees and the water and the stars and the darkness between them. She was small and temporary and unimportant. But she was here. She was present. She was alive. And that was enough. That was more than enough. She climbed down from the lookout tower and walked back to the cabin. The windows were glowing with the light of the fire she had left burning. Smoke rose from the chimney straight up into the still night air. Home. The word had meant so many things to her over the years. The ranch house in Spokane where she had grown up, which had never quite felt like hers. The hostels and couches and bus stations where she had slept during her 2 years of wandering. The mountains and trails and wild places where she had always felt most herself. And now this cabin, this clearing, this silence. This was home. This was where she belonged. She went inside and sat down at the heavy wooden table. The letter from Josiah was in its leather portfolio on the shelf next to her journal, next to the books she was currently reading. She did not need to take it out. She knew what it said. But she thought about it anyway. She thought about the line that had stayed with her most through the long winter, and the difficult spring and the golden summer, and now this perfect autumn evening. I will trust the mountains to decide the way I have trusted them for 13 years. The mountains had decided. They had decided to bring her here. They had decided to let her stay. They had decided to teach her everything Josiah had promised they would teach her. And someday, many years from now, the mountains would decide something else. They would decide that it was time for her to go. Maybe she would walk out of this cabin one winter day and never come back, the way Josiah might have done. Maybe she would grow old here and die in her bed and be found by a hiker years later. Bones and dust and silence. Maybe she would leave the way she had come, walking out over the pass, with her backpack on her shoulders, returning to a world she had almost forgotten existed. She did not know. She could not know. But she trusted the mountains to decide. The way Josiah had trusted them. The way anyone who truly loved a wild place had to trust it. You did not own these places. They owned you. And the best you could do was be worthy of them for as long as they let you stay. Wren Calloway was 21 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a ranger station 14 miles from the nearest road in the mountains of central Idaho. She found almost $40,000 in a metal cabinet that had not been opened in 53 years. She found a letter from a dead man who had trusted the mountains to choose his successor. She found books and maps and silence and solitude. and a life that was harder and more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. She survived her first winter. She learned what the cabin had to teach. She became the person the mountains had chosen her to become. It was the best $10 she ever spent. Outside the cabin, the wind moved through the lodgepole pines, making the branches sway and whisper. The creek ran over stones on its way down to the valley below. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had wheeled over these mountains since the beginning of time. And in the cabin, in the light of the fire, Wren opened her journal and began to write. She wrote about the day, about the weather, about the visitors who had come and gone, about the light on the mountains at sunset, and the sound of the raven calling across the valley. She wrote about Josiah Hartwell and the gift he had left behind. She wrote about her mother, Marlene, who had smiled and shaken her head and thought it was a phase. She wrote it was not a phase. She wrote, I am home. She wrote, the mountains decided. And then she closed the journal and put it back on the shelf and banked the fire for the night and climbed into her bed and pulled the blankets up to her chin. Outside, the wind sang in the pines. The stars blazed in the darkness. The mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping watch over the little cabin in the clearing. The cabin where a young woman slept. The cabin where a man had lived and loved and left everything behind the cabin that would stand for another 50 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, waiting for whoever the mountains chose next. Wren Calloway slept, and in her dreams she was 8 years old again, sitting on a kitchen floor with a road atlas in her lap, tracing the green spaces with her finger, looking at where she was gonna live someday.